this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
The 7th Infantry Regiment, known as the Cottonbalers, is one of the oldest units in the US Army, originally formed in 1812. It has fought in nearly every major American conflict, including the Civil War, both World Wars, Korea and Iraq. Renowned for its bravery and deep traditions, the regiment remains an active combat unit to this day. For this episode, I'm joined by Professor John McManus, whose 2009 book, American Courage, American Carnage, chronicles the unit's remarkable history. During World War II, the 7th landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, fought through Sicily and Italy, stormed the beaches of southern France in Operation Dragoon, and ended the war as the first American unit to reach Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. The regiment also takes centre stage in the upcoming computer game Burden of Command, where John served as the historical advisor. And if you'd like to hear more about the game, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. John, thanks for joining me. As I mentioned in the introduction, sort of the 7th Infantry Regiment is one of the Army's oldest units. How did you first become interested in them?
The way this all came about is, I'm certainly an infantry-oriented historian and whatever. And my wife asked me one night many years ago, we were having dinner, and she said, is there any infantry unit that traces its lineage all the way back to the American Revolution? And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting question. And the answer is largely no, because the Army, though it still technically existed, it's disbanded after independence initially, because the thinking is we don't want a regular army. We're afraid of that kind of thing. You know, that's what we were fighting against. We'll just fight with militia. So they find out otherwise they need real professional soldiers as time goes forward. So there's tension with France, like a war scare in 1798 under the John Adams administration. That fortunately doesn't blow up into a major war. So you have the regiment stood up for a while and then stood down. And then, of course, we have the blow up with Britain that we call the War of 1812. That's when you really see the firm establishment of the 7th Infantry Regiment, especially in the Battle of New Orleans, where they are one of two regular Army regiments available to General Andrew Jackson. And they play a key role in that particular battle. And that's where the nickname of the regiment comes from, the Cottonbalers. So it was said that they had fought the British from behind bales of cotton. Now, in my research, I realized that that's probably not true. I mean, you really wouldn't want to do that because cotton is flammable. So I think probably what they meant is that they maybe used cotton bales from a nearby plantation to buttress their ramparts, their fortifications, something like that. But nonetheless, the nickname stuck, and even to this day, wherever the 7th Infantry Regiment goes, there's this heavy, ungainly cotton bale, like 40, 50 pounds, that this poor private has to trundle along with the regimental colors under the gentle supervision of a sergeant major, usually. And so that's the regimental identity, that they are cotton balers.
This is my complete ignorance from being a Brit. In Britain, our regiments are often geographically based. That's not the case in the US. I guess in 1798, half of America's not even America yet. But is there a geographic home? How do they recruit?
So in the case of the 7th Infantry Regiment, they're a regular Army unit. So through most of their history, it's really a national orientation. Now, there will be times, though, when you will have a kind of regional slant, the tendency, not by design, but the tendency. So like the War of 1812, most of these guys who were in the 7th came from like Kentucky and Tennessee and whatever. But if we're talking about now, they're from everywhere. If we're talking about World War II, they're from everywhere. Now, we do have National Guard units, and those are state-oriented units. So you might have a regiment there of people from Missouri or from Wisconsin or something. But the 7th Infantry Regiment is a regular Army unit, so they're going to tend to draw from a national base for their soldiers.
Yeah, I'm sure half my listeners already knew that. That was just my complete ignorance being a Brit. I've often wondered how how geographic American units were, because I was a very
no problem, absolutely.
I was a very territorial. Now they say actually throughout the 19th century, there can't be much that they've not fought in Did they fighting everything? I mean, I'm looking at the list now. There's things I'd never even heard of.
Oh, they're in everything. When you talk about the old original infantry regiments of the United States Army, and there aren't very many of them, of course, that have been on continuous service from 200 years ago to now, most of them probably would have sat out either Korea or Vietnam. And the reason was that they may have been serving in Europe under NATO, and then that takes them maybe away from Korea and Vietnam or whatever. The 7th was different in that it fought in all the old wars and then all the modern wars too. And then, of course, as things turned out into the 21st century, both Iraq and Afghanistan. So they're just this kind of bellwether unit that always ends up in every fight, whether it's famous or not. From the early 19th century, they're out there fighting Native Americans. They're in the Seminole Wars in the 1840s. That's in Florida primarily. They in the Mexican-American Wars, when you really see the 7th play an absolutely leading role, especially in General Winfield Scott's campaign to, invade Mexico and conquer Mexico City. The 7th is absolutely a huge part of that. In the battles of Cerro Gordo, Churubusco, Chapultepec, I mean, you name it, it's like the lead assault unit in a way.
Well, I didn't realise that they're there with Custer. Well, they're not there with Custer, but they're there with Custer as well, aren't they?
Well, they help save what remains of Custer's command, actually. It's really interesting because 1876, if you're talking about a campaign against what was the Lakota Sioux, the Oglala Sioux, the Cheyennes, some of their other allies, the problem is one of mobility. Infantry doesn't have that much mobility on this open prairie and whatnot. And so, it's very much a cavalryman's war. And the Native American tribes really have a tactical and mobility advantage on the United States Army. And they're really soldier for soldier. They're really better on many levels. The reason I think why Custer did what he did, the difficulty is actually chasing them down and pinning them down and getting them to do battle as the U.S. Army would want them, to fight. So when Custer finally chases down what is the core of this Native American military force, as he sees it at least, he's like, I've got to attack while I have the advantage on them, he thinks. So he doesn't wait for the 7th Infantry Regiment, which is slower and has a little bit of artillery. He doesn't wait for them to join up with him, which would have, I think, probably saved his command. So what happens instead, of course, he attacks the Sioux and the Cheyennes, and there's Arapaho too. And obviously they vastly outnumber him, and they overwhelm and destroy his command. Now there's a part of his command though that was under Marcus Reno, that was atop a prominent ridgeline, a hilltop that the Native Americans could not overwhelm. So the next day, June 26, 1876, the 7th Infantry Regiment gets there on site and hooks up with Reno's guys and dissuades the Native Americans from continuing their attack. So they actually save portions of the 7th Cavalry and the 7th Infantry, the first ones to actually see what had happened to Custer and his guys. It's really quite poignant.
They're seemingly there everywhere. They're there in the First World War. They managed to if you want to put pins in places that people have heard of, it's like Belleau Wood, Moose Aragorn, Big Mountain. They're there. But those interwar years, the American Army draws down quite a lot. How, in the 30s, 20s and 30s, how does that affect the unit? Are they brought down to next to nothing, or do they manage to survive being a regular unit?
What remains of the U.S. Army, they are really something of the core of it. As of World War I, they're part of the 3rd Infantry Division, the famous 3rd ID, which, of course, gets its nickname in World War I, Rock of the Marne, from stopping, the Ludendorff offensive along the Marne River and like you said, at Belleau Wood. All of that is something of the same fight, sort of, to stop the Ludendorff offensive. And so that establishes the 7th's relationship as part of the 3rd Division. And that remains to this day, 100 years later. Now, there will be some variations where the 7th Infantry Regiment will, confusingly enough, be attached to other divisions at times. But for the most part, World Wars I and II, nowadays, they're part of the 3rd ID. So the interwar period, the U.S. military forces are vastly downsized. The Congress kind of puts its security eggs in the National Guard basket in a way, saying, well, if there's a crisis, we've got all these National Guard units we can then mobilize and stand up in the event of that. So we'll parse on our regulars, but among the regulars that did exist, the 7th will remain. And so it was a place where volunteers joined up and, basically served in their own little world mainly like at Vancouver Barracks, which is in Washington in the northwest part of the country, which is a really nice post. And life centered around athletic competitions among, company to company or unit, regiment to regiment, that kind of thing. Officers kind of ruled like lords, and so did NCOs. People would serve 3, 5 year enlistments. In the 20s, it was hard to recruit people. In the 30s, not as much because, of course, the Great Depression. There's a lot of people who decided this is a job. I can get a job and get three squares, whereas I'm out on the streets, in civilian life. So the seventh is actually, if we're talking about like on the eve of World War II, the seventh is really quite an elite unit, relatively speaking, in the U.S. Armed Forces because of, there's been all these hardscrabble guys who have joined up and have become soldiers in the context of this economic crisis and have kind of found a home for themselves. They become the cadre for, this larger force that'll come into being once the U.S. is in World War II.
They must have been one of the first units to be called up to be sent overseas because they're already a standing unit. Presumably, they expand as well.
Exactly. No, that's right. Exactly. So they're at Vancouver Barracks, and of course, then the war happens, and the Army cobbles together the 3rd Division again, and so the 15th Infantry, which is like it's sort of like the 7th sister regiment in a way. And 15th Infantry is kind of famous because there was a guy named Audie Murphy who was part of the 15th, and everybody knows him. The 15th had actually been in China, part of the open door in China and all that. So the 15th, the 7th, and the 30th then become the core of what is the 3rd ID in World War II. And so they become one of the first amphibious trained divisions, which then puts them in line for Operation Torch. Like you said, for the early days of the U.S., right. So November 1942, they lead the way into invading Morocco, like around Casablanca, Fadela. So you have them, and then you have the Army's other major bellwether regular division, the 1st, also famous, the big red one. They'll invaded Algeria. And so really from the beginning in World War II, the Cottonbalers as part of the 3rd ID are right there at the start at Operation Torch, and then they're going to be fighting all the way across the Mediterranean in Italy, South France, and on into Germany. It's there's hundreds of days of combat.
This is where you don't know if they're lucky or unlucky.
Unlucky.
Yeah, for those men who landed in November and still there in 45. What I am intrigued by is we often refer to they're amphibious trained. They land at Torch, and when it comes to amphibious landings, people refer to a learning curve, and I'm not always sure quite what the learning curve was other than throw more at it. But I'm intrigued by how did that landing go? Because it would be the first American amphibious landing.
Technically not, but in
I was going to say in Europe, not necessarily the
exactly,
Pacific.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, because we're thinking like as of mid 1942, we're going to have these amphibious invasions, and of course they're like, oh my gosh, we need to invade Guadalcanal. Let's look around to see where we can have an amphibious trained division. At that point, they lay hands on the 1st Marine Division to do that job and parts of the 2nd Marine Division. That's what they got, but it's a global war. So the 1st and the 3rd divisions are earmarked for, what we'll call Europe, but obviously we know it's North Africa. There'll be others. There'll be the 9th, the 34th, 1st Armored, so on and so forth that are going to be part of the mix too. But really the 1st and the 3rd are the leaders in this. What's interesting is how they've trained up for this, because it's like you've got to reorganize and reorient your units based on the shipping available. So how many people can we get aboard a troop ship? How many landing craft can we get on there? What are the landing craft made out of? Do we have enough of them? How do we reorganize platoons to be situated in a Higgins boat, the famous Higgins boat landing craft? So it becomes like a boat section rather than a traditional platoon, and then you reorganize once ashore. So all this amphibious training, you got to do that, and then of course getting on and off the ship. So you got to be trained like going down the famous rope nets, make sure to grasp them from the outside rather than the inside, so that the guy above you doesn't step on your hand. How much equipment you need, what you do in terms of getting ashore, like how you figure out your fire teams, your mortar sections once they're ashore, where they go. So it was really quite elaborate. You couldn't just take an average division and say, okay, well, now you're amphibious. It required some training. The 7th Infantry had done a lot of training at Monterey. in California. So by the time of Torch, they're pretty well conversant with this. And then they're gonna carry out more amphibious invasions than any regiment in the U.S. Armed Forces in World War II. So I mean they've got that skill set. And oh, by the way, once they're ashore, they're a go-to fighting unit. That's in the meat grinder attritional war that we're also familiar with. Obviously that's post Torch. That's especially mainly like from Sicily onward. Then that's when things get really sharp.
And how was that landing in North Africa for it? Was it a Saving Private Ryan moment, or were they ambling up the beach?
No, I mean, and I don't want to paint it as a complete walkover. It's not. There's some French and French colonials who want to fight. But the main challenge you've got is the darkness. Normandy is our first daylight amphibious landing. I mean, the others are at night. And so this is a, pre-dawn landing and in heavy seas. So the biggest challenge you've got is the heavy seas, smashing the landing craft against rocks, because that's kind of a rocky coastline. That's the bigger challenge than French fire. Once you're ashore, there are going to be strong points that you have to deal with. So yeah, it's certainly not like Saving Private Ryan or anything. It's really, maybe a little more analogous to Sicily in that it's not safe. You're going to get ashore okay, but there's a lot of ways to face danger in the days to come. But you certainly have a major qualitative advantage over an enemy that may or may not want to fight. The 7th has to basically fight its way into Casablanca. And they're going to face resistance. They're going to be doing that up and down some of the coast along Fadela there. So it's about a 5 to 7 day period where we're doing this. It's child's play compared to what we're going to have later against the Germans, though, of course. But they're learning a lot of lessons about how to get ashore and fight once they're ashore.
When it comes to the amphibious assault on Husky, which they're part of, now Husky, for all kinds of reasons, it goes right and wrong. How was their amphibious landing on Husky?
Very, very similar to what happens in Morocco. Another pre-dawn nighttime landing. We've got better landing craft by this time. We've got better artillery preparation, though there's concerns about some of the Italian strong points along the coast. Now, they're manned by coastal defense units that may or may not want to fight, but there are instances where the 7th takes like 47 millimeter gunfire. It's no easy peasy kind of walkover. But you have a lot of advantages. Again, very, very similar. But the bigger problem is once you're ashore, the reaction then among the German units that are on Sicily, the Hermann Goering Division and the 15th Panzer Grenadier, but also some of the Italian units, Ossieta, a couple others. So it's really a matter of kind of maintaining that beachhead. Now, admittedly, the most ferocious Axis resistance is against the 1st Division beachhead right next door, to our right, basically, at Gela. And of course, that's the focus of the Axis response to the invasion. But the 7th Infantry Regiment is the entire western flank of the Allied front. So this is a little precarious because what Axis resistance you have there could possibly roll up the flank of the 3rd ID beachhead and thus the whole Allied front. So you got 7th Army and 7th Infantry Regiment. I know that's confusing. That's basically the entire western flank of the Allied front, all the way to Syracuse, where Montgomery's 8th Army is operating, and then everything in between. So this isn't an accident. The 7th Infantry Regiment is given that job by Lucian Truscott, a remarkable commander of the 3rd ID, because he feels that it's the most reliable regiment that he's got among 3 outstanding regiments. Truscott has trained these guys really well, and as things turn out, they're going to hold that flank no problem. But from the soldier's point of view, you would have some casualties in your unit, mainly woundings at this stage. And now you're dealing with the heat, the heat and the conditions, and you're not quite sure what's happening with the population. And that becomes a little difficult.
That's where that's where I've struggled with lieutenant and lieutenants. You're lieutenants, aren't you? The lieutenant of the, I don't know why it doesn't stick with me. I'm guaranteed to use the wrong one at the wrong time. John
Heinkes. Yeah. So he is, at this point, he's a lieutenant colonel. John Heinkes is fascinating. His mother had emigrated from Germany. So he's really a German American. His mother married a professional soldier. And so he kind of grows up in the army. as his stepdad is a big influence on him, and he decides he wants to go to West Point. He does. And so he's a very young battalion commander, military professional. And he plays a leading role here, and eventually he's going to command the regiment by the time the war is over. That's in the future. At this point, he's a battalion commander. He has this incredible moment during the Sicily battle. This is sort of emblematic of the situation you're facing. Most of the population is excited to see you and views you as liberators. Of course, we know there's been so much Italian and Sicilian immigration to the United States, 20 or so years before this. So you've got a lot of Italian-American GIs who speak the language, or you're encountering a lot of people who have cousins, brothers, family, back in America, and are asking on them, and they're happy to see you. So that's great. But there's also danger out there because there's still some Italian units that want to fight. There's fascists that are out there. And of course, there's the prospect of the Germans who are out there. But in this case, in a town one day, there's a sniper who's causing some damage. And Heinkus is like, well, I think the only way to flush this guy out and get him without causing mass destruction to the town is for one of us just to serve as a decoy, as bait. So he decides it's going to be him, and he basically steps out from cover as sort of this bait while he has a bazooka team, eagle-eyeing to see where the sniper could be. So he's tempting the guy to shoot. And, the guy reveals his position and the bazooka team nails him. Fortunately, Heinkus survives, but it's so fascinating. I mean, it's a classic example, lead from the front kind of person, but also he's lucky because he could end up killed too. Fortunately, he didn't get killed.
Because he complained of losing men to stragglers, sort of disappearing.
Oh, big time. Yeah, that's a problem for every American unit on Sicily, especially as you're going west. Patton's famous movement west and north up to
his reconnaissance in force.
Exactly, and the 7th is at the vanguard of that. And so, so you've got fields full of olives and watermelons and other types of melons, whatever. I mean, you've got all these crops out there. It's hot. People are thirsty, they're tired, they're dusty. The supplies may or may not be catching up with you. It's pretty tempting to go out there in those fields, especially if you're not under fire, which a lot of times are not. And so the Sicilian farmers may not have been as excited about the Americans coming as maybe people in the towns were, because they're like a pack of locusts out there, just eating in their fields. So the 7th has issues with that. But here again, Truscott has trained these guys to really road march, and they're in phenomenal physical condition. So you're in the heat of the Sicilian summer, and he really establishes discipline and gets them out of the fields and gets them back moving towards Palermo. I mean, that's the main objective. And he wants them on foot, too. There's a funny incident where I think it's Heinkus. I could be wrong. It could have been one of the other battalion commanders. But Truscott discovers that one of these commanders is riding on a donkey and has some of his soldiers basically riding donkeys, and he says, guys, dismount. We're infantry. We're not donkey riders, So it's just kind of funny. You see Truscott's dynamism emblem, cloaked over this whole thing.
Now they missed the invasion of Italy. They've probably felt relieved they've done 2. They don't necessarily need to do a third at that point. It's during the Italy campaign that Floyd Lindstrom in November gets his Medal of Honor in the regiment. What did he do to get that?
So this is post Salerno. The third idea will be a reinforcing unit for the Allied beachhead at Salerno, which we know is in such crisis for several days. So once that crisis passes, the third ID plays a leading role in making that left turn up, plunging into the mountains that are leading towards Naples and beyond, to the Volturno River and whatnot. So Lindstrom, I think he was in K Company, 7th Infantry Regiment. I could be wrong. He's fighting deep into the hills and mountains. And so you've got a really dicey situation in which combat units are spread thin up in high ground in which we can't get to them. We can't supply them well. It's hard to evacuate the wounded. So Lindstrom's fight is happening in the context of a really elemental, quite savage fight of small groups of Germans and small groups of Americans fighting deep into these mountains, where it becomes sometimes, honestly, killing each other with rocks and bayonets kind of thing. Lindstrom is a guy who holds a position in that kind of manner. It's absolutely just one of the most elemental fights in the history of the regiment of World War II. You're going to have number of Medal of Honor recipients from the regiment of World War II. I think Lindstrom's the first. I believe he is, but so his fight is happening in that context of these really grim days in the fall of 1943 in basically Alpine warfare.
I was under the impression when you won the Medal of Honor, you didn't serve in combat. You were removed from combat, but actually that's because John Basilone is not removed from combat, is he, in the Pacific?
He was, but he's sent home on a war bond tour, and he's there for quite some time. But then he volunteered to go back, and he fought and died in the Battle of Iwo Jima.
But Floyd Lindstrom's not pulled out the line, is he?
No, because he didn't want to be. So he probably could have been, but as I understand it, in Lindstrom's case, he decided, no, my position is here. He didn't think he'd done anything different than any other soldier. I think that's sometimes very true of these guys. They're just like, okay, well, this is what I do, and I don't want to leave my guys, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, Lindstrom, as I understand it, could have left the line. But of course, the whole Medal of Honor thing, I mean, that takes a long time administratively. Meanwhile, the war is going on and he's doing his job. He stays on the line. I think he was killed in action later, if I'm not mistaken.
Anzio.
Yeah. Yeah, at Anzio. Yeah, that's right.
Which is, a couple of months later, which was quite surprising because I thought you had your arm twisted to to go back to the US because they didn't want to lose heroes.
They would hope to, but by the time the wheels turn to get somebody decorated with the medal, a lot could have happened in the meantime. And, and in most cases, they didn't necessarily want to leave the line. So Basilone's a unique case in the sense that it's a bit of a one-off, fighting this Japanese attack for a couple of days. His division is being evacuated from, or withdrawn, maybe I should say, from Guadalcanal. So it's a little easier to kind of make that happen for him to go home, versus just a regular infantryman fighting in the context of this larger campaign. So it's a different animal in a way.
Well, as we sort of hinted at, the regiment ends up at Anzio, which is their third amphibious assault landing. How is Anzio for them? Because in some respects, Anzio is usually seen as an easy landing. It just goes downhill from there.
Yeah, the landing is easy. It's what follows from there. It's so there again. They're in the lead for the Allies as they land at Anzio. Obviously, it's an Anglo-American operation. So the 7th Infantry Regiment, once again, leading the way for the 3rd ID. Once again, it's a nighttime assault. And so here again, there's like almost no resistance. This is among their invasions in the war. This is the easiest. And even if we count Salerno, it wasn't necessarily that easy once they got ashore because the whole beachhead is under fire and all that, but they're not leading the way in invasion. But in this case, yeah, they lead the way. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is easy. Now what do we do? So here they are, basically hunkering down. Famously, the Allies kind of lose that initiative in that first 3 to 5 days. They're just kind of cooling their heels for a while until the end of January. So this is almost 8, 9, 10 days later when they're going to be the lead guys pushing for a town called Cisterna di Littorio.
So do they take part in the breakout and the Clarks push to Rome? Are they in the vanguard of that as well?
They are. So there's a lot happens in that regard. So the Cisterna fight is very tragic because the Allies are like, okay, we can finally start moving, pushing for Rome. But by then, the Germans have had time to react, and they're sending people there. And so Cisterna is a meeting engagement where both sides are attacking, not quite knowing what the other is doing. And we famously, of course, lose 2 whole Ranger battalions there that are basically attached to the 3rd ID. So they're part of this same fight around the Mussolini Canal and Cisterna. The 7th Infantry fights ferociously at Cisterna. It's very possible they could have been annihilated like the Rangers were, but they're in a little bit better terrain and tactical position, and they've got more support from the whole division and its artillery and all that. So that fight leads, of course, to the stalemate at Anzio, which they're part of, but too, and I think February, the Germans launched these very, very powerful attacks to try and snuff out the beachhead. So the Cottonbalers are dealing with that. So it's really quite horrendous. But yeah, they really, in a way, casualty-wise, the deadliest time would have been Operation Diadem in May 1944, the push and the breakout from Anzio. And so here again, we go back to Cisterna, where it's a crossroads town. By then, the Germans have fortified it. All these like dugouts and pillboxes and mines and all that. So some of the most casualty-intensive days for the regiment of World War II were in mid-May 1944 during what was a victory, in this push for Rome, but it was extraordinarily costly. You're talking about 80% casualty rates in the rifle companies. I mean, that kind of thing.
Presumably, once the breakouts happened, are they allowed to have a breather, these frontline units? Or are they expected to have a breather on the move?
So they're on the move, and they're in some pretty ferocious fights, like around Valmontone and like the road to Rome, and there's a lot of mobile fights as the Germans are retreating, but still quite dangerous. They have a wonderful moment where they get into Rome against no resistance there, and they get to enjoy Rome, and they enjoy Rome for maybe about a couple of weeks or so. That's really one of the best parts of the whole war for the Cottonbalers. But eventually they're withdrawn from Rome to basically train up to prepare for the next invasion, which is South France, Operation Dragoon, in August 1944. So they spend part of the summer training up for that. They don't go farther north of Rome and all that business. They're kind of withdrawn from the line. So they're spared that nightmare, but they're earmarked to go on and lead the next invasion.
Presumably they get restocked. That's not the what I'm looking for. Presumably they get new recruits to blend in,
constantly
mix in.
So the regiment, typically would have been about 3,000 soldiers. But if we're talking about the kind of casualty rates we are, you can imagine how many times these units, the companies and platoons and whatnot, are going to turn over in the course of the war. I mean, let's say you were part of one of the rifle companies during Operation Torch, and you were still on your feet as of Rome. You were definitely a fugitive from the law of averages. So in most cases, it's, people who've been wounded and come back, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, so you're constantly taking in new people, new replacements coming from the States. They come from all over. But what was interesting about this, and this really got my attention as an historian of combat and combat units and World War II in particular, even though you have this constant cycle of people in this meat grinder of a war going on day after day, when you guys came to the 7th Infantry Regiment in World War II, there was still generally someone who told them something about the regimental lineage, the history, the identity, and that really made a difference. It's what we now call a force multiplier. I know it's self-serving, but the history, I think, can really matter. And I think the best commanders understood that. And I think largely during the war, the 7th did, because there was a sense of identity. Whereas with many other units, guys would join anonymously and they're like, I don't even know who these guys are, or what this unit is, and you're not invested in it as much. And so I think that was one reason why the 7th tended to be a pretty successful combat unit in World War II, because of that sense of identity. And and it had that advantage of a long lineage.
Well, I would say you point to an esprit de corps of look at what we've achieved in the past, this is what you've got to live up to with our battle honours, as it were. Now, you mentioned Dragoon now, which is, someone pointed out to me, it's one of those things that I have never looked at or discussed, is Dragoon. It always gets overlooked. It's one of those, it is a major amphibious event we never really talk about, because D-Day's taken the oxygen out of it all. This Cobra's happening at the same time the breakout's happening. So what was Dragoon like for the 7th Infantry? Was this bit more of a contested landing?
It is. And in fact, so it's August 15th, 1944, and it's actually the deadliest day in World War II for the 7th Infantry Regiment. And the main reason is mines, landing craft that are touching off mines. So we tend to forget that the Normandy invasion was never really intended to be a one-off for the Allies, that there was supposed to be a complementary invasion. Of course, famously, the Germans are supposed to think it's coming at Calais and all that. Yes, of course. But Eisenhower had always insisted on hammer and anvil kind of concept here of catching the Germans in a vice, just as we had done in North Africa. But of course, why is there a 2-month lag in these invasions? Because of shipping and all the other logistical issues we've got. So by August 15th, we can do that. And then there's famously a knockdown, drag-out argument at the strategic level between Churchill and the Americans. Churchill wanting to double down on operations in the Balkans and Italy, and the Americans saying, no, we're going forward with South France, and the Americans get what they want. So the 7th Infantry, of course, still part of the 3rd ID, is going to invade on the western flank of the whole invasion. Here we have that again. And so here are some pretty highly experienced people at the staff level, sometimes at the command level, who understand a lot about amphibious operations. So the resistance, what characterizes it? Germany's 19th Army, which is defending South France, is kind of a hollow army at this point because obviously Normandy, like you said, has just sucked all the oxygen out of everything, and they've had to send most of what they got in there. That's true. So there's a lot of Aussies, Eastern Europeans, who have been impressed into German uniform. But there's also Germans, and there's a Panzer division, and they've got good weapons too. So even crappy soldiers with good weapons can be very dangerous. So there's some of that, and then there's the mines. And so that really, the mines getting ashore, like underwater mines and whatnot, and obstacles. And then once ashore, there's a lot of minefields, there's a lot of teller mines, and so we're suffering casualties from that too. But the invasion is really quite successful, but it is not a walkover. Like I said, that day is the deadliest day for the regiment in World War II, and I think that really says something.
It sort of gets hand waved away, doesn't it, because of everything else going on, and it's just felt a bit of a walk in the park. No, Steven Spielberg really needs to make a film about it and put it back on the map.
That would be great if he did, because there's a lot there. I mean, it's a very important invasion too, I would argue, and I know this becomes kind of a British American thing in the after-war period of the British saying, "Oh, we could have." Met the Soviets much farther east. It was ridiculous to double down on France and all this. But I will point out, we've got serious logistical problems at the end of Normandy and post-Normandy, and especially in not controlling ports that can help feed and sustain our armies.
So, are they part of the gallop across France from Dragoon? Because presumably they've got further to go. I mean, that must be a bit of are they walking or hitching rides just to drive across France?
Both.
Yeah.
It's both. Yeah. So they're walking, they're on trucks, they're riding on tanks. Just kind of depends what day we're talking about. They're liberating towns. It's festive. They're fighting alongside French troops. Some of them are Maquis guys who have come down from the mountains or whatever and are now going to join the U.S. forces. There's 3 French divisions that land in the wake of the Americans. And these are the colonials from North Africa alongside some French and whatever. There's more and more of a like bona fide French military presence that's going to be in play with the French First Army that's fighting alongside the American Seventh Army, of which the 7th Infantry is a part. So you have this mobile campaign up the Rhone Valley, late August 1944. You're just chasing the Germans down, clobbering them. It's very similar to the breakout from Normandy. And then, of course, once these guys go up the Rhone Valley, they take a right turn, obviously, towards Germany. So by September, they're starting to get in what's called the Vosges, like the Vosges Mountains and forested areas, and that's tougher terrain. The logistical problems are coming into play. It's very similar to what's happened to the armies that are broken out of Normandy. As you get closer to the German frontier, things get tougher and the weather starts to worsen. And so by October, now you're in a situation where the momentum has slowed down and the weather's getting colder and rainier. And now you're fighting in this brooding, kind of confining forest terrain. And it's really becomes quite a difficult and sometimes desperate fight as we get October and November at that stage.
When do they assault the Siegfried line? Is that, I've failed to note the date.
It's a little later.
Is that later?
It's a little later. So they spend the 7th Infantry and, of course, the 3rd ID spends the fall of 1944 in the Vosges, basically fighting town to town, river to river. The core of it for the 7th Infantry is a town called St. Die, wonderful name, right? Which they cross a river called the Meurthe River. And by now, I mean, they're absolute 100% bona fide experts at river crossings ever since Sicily, basically. And so they're going to do that quite successfully, but there's only so far you can get logistically and terrain-wise and whatever else. So they kind of capstone 1944 in taking Strasbourg, very important city for the French, of course. There's not a lot of fighting in Strasbourg, but you've gotten to the Rhine River. By the time you're at the Siegfried line, a lot has happened. The Battle of the Bulge happens farther to north. The 7th Infantry is not part of that. But they are going to be part of something lesser known, what's called Operation Northwind or Nordwind. Hitler, being the lunatic that he is, decides once he fails in the Bulge, okay, I'll launch another smaller offensive farther to the south against the U.S. 7th Army. And that's like in Alsace. The 7th is tangentially involved in that. Once that peters out, now you're going to be fighting in the Colmar pocket. That's in January and February 1945. That's the last part of France that's still under German control. So The 7th is involved in very, very heavy winter fighting. So we're talking like hip deep snow, dugout to dugout, town to town, horrendous fighting. So if you can make it through that, yes, then the Siegfried line beckons for you after that. So that's generally by like March 1945.
Loyal listener, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment. So we're really coming close to the end of the war now, but what fascinated me was they're the first into Berchtesgaden, but it's not recognised necessarily. And I can't remember who's first there in Band of Brothers.
Well, they say Easy Company 506, Band of Brothers.
Well, I was just checking, because I thought that was the case. I didn't know how much of a nod they gave to anybody else.
It's just such nonsense. And the way this whole thing starts. So there's a lot that happens here. The Cottonbalers fight their way through the Siegfried line, basically pillbox dugout, that kind of thing. But they have a very heavy fight ahead of them in April 1945 at Nuremberg in major urban combat there. That was no walkover. That is one of the heaviest urban battles in all of World War II, honestly. They've been through that experience, and now they're given the next assignment to go further south and get Berchtesgaden. And this isn't just any kind of prestige thing. There's a lot of concern at Eisenhower's level that that you're going to have fanatical Nazis hold out in Berchtesgaden and the other mountainous areas as a redoubt kind of thing. Now, of course, we know as historians, looking back on it, that's all overrated and it doesn't happen. They don't know that at the time. So there's two key objectives we have to have. Obviously, Berlin, and the Soviets are doing that, and Berchtesgaden. And so you've got kind of a race for Berchtesgaden as we get into May, and it's pretty much a priority for all these units that are in play to get there. So there's three that are possibly in play: French 2nd Armored, U.S. 101st Airborne Division, and U.S. 3rd Division. The 3rd Division has the advantage on the other two in that it's ahead of them, and it crosses what's called the Salak River first, and could then control the bridges that you had to have in order to get to Berchtesgaden. So the division commander by now is a guy named General John Iron Mike O'Daniel, and he wants his guys to get Hitler's home and the town of Berchtesgaden. And so he tells his soldiers, nobody's passing over these bridges until our guys get there. Which unit in the 3rd ID is going to get the lead role? We all know what that is. 7th Infantry Regiment. And so this isn't like a heavy battle. This is more like a mobile convoy thing in which there could be danger, but you're going into the heart of Nazism in a way. And everybody had heard about Hitler's home and were curious to see it. And so the 7th gets there first on the afternoon of May 4th, 1945. And basically secures the town, secures Hitler's home, the famous Eagle's Nest, which is different from the home. It's like a tea house built atop a nearby mountain, and you've got to take an elevator to get up there that's cut, into the shaft of the mountain and all that. So the 101st arrives more or less the next day. So how does this myth originate? Unfortunately, I'll be the first to admit Stephen Ambrose was an influence on me, of course, and I think he did amazing work on some levels, but he wasn't always the most careful person in relation to facts. And so what he did is he just took the veterans at their word, because all veterans think they're the first to do this or that or whatever. You have to actually, corroborate these things. And so he just took them at their word. He wrote it in his book, and then it got replicated in the miniseries without any kind of corroboration. And it's really unfortunate, because when you look in the actual 101st Airborne records, they say the same thing, that the 3rd ID got there first, and they changed over and took over Berchtesgaden from them. Then 3rd ID moved on to Salzburg, normal stuff. So this mythology that happens, it's really, really awful, honestly, because I'll tell you, when this is a long time ago, but when Band of Brothers came out, many of the 7th Infantry veterans of Berchtesgaden were still alive, of course, and they were so angry about it that they wanted to take legal action to prevent the miniseries from airing. And I remember at the time saying, no, that's not really a good idea. You'll come off not the right way, but really what we ought to have is Dr. Ambrose say, what actually happened. And he admitted to them privately that they were right and he was wrong, but he never said it publicly, regretfully. But so I'm constantly battering up against this. And I know it may seem obnoxious to some people, but imagine if you had, done something that was world historical important. You did that and you deserve the laurels for it for whatever reason. And then someone comes along later and says they did it. How would you feel? So I think, from their perspective, I think it's best that we understand what actually happened. They got there first, for whatever that means, whatever it matters. That's the historical reality. The French were not happy too, I should point out. The French Second Armor. There were some tense moments there, near violence, and eventually they're going to have a joint ceremony involving the Cottonbalers and the French, flag raising and all that. I also found out too in my research that there was violence between the paratroopers and the Cottonbalers, that a paratrooper shot one of the 7th Infantry soldiers. I think alcohol was probably involved in that, but I don't know that for sure. But yeah, so it was, so the regiment ends the war basically on that note.
It's funny, it's a misunderstanding. It's where as history, as it falls out of being living history and culture sort of takes over forming history, that films and written books take on a life of their own beyond the actual history.
Exactly. Once something is solidified in a great movie, a great miniseries, as Band of Brothers clearly is, it's so hard to come along and say, no, that's not what happened. Here's what and you become the buzzkill. You become like the killjoy, and they're almost like, yeah, I know you're right, but I don't want to hear it, and it's there's a lot of times just that dynamic. I get it, but it's still frustrating.
How quick is the unit returned to the US at the end of the war? They have been through absolutely everything, so one might assume that it's first in, first out.
Nope. They're going to stick around in the Salzburg area, and they're going to do occupation duty, and it's very, very frustrating because, you got tension with the Soviets. You've got this is, again, a microcosm. You've been fighting these kinetic tactical operations for who knows how long. There's the enemy, kill them, win the war. Now it's a total humanitarian operation and stability and support. Now you got to feed your former enemies and care for them. Now there's Allied POWs you got to help. There's concentration camp survivors, Holocaust survivors who you're trying to help. Imagine this as a commander. Most of your guys want to go home, so there's morale problems. It's restive, so it's a while. They're there for many, many months after World War II. Eventually, I think it's by late 46 and 47, they're going to be redeployed back to Fort Devens in Massachusetts and go back into the whole peacetime thing. And, you can imagine the personnel turnover and all that. Of course, then we have this little thing called the Korean War that breaks out in 1950. And they're basically almost first in there, that once again, Third ID reconstituted and they're sent back over there. So they're going to be in play in the Korean War by the fall of 1950. So pretty early in the game. So yeah, the 7th Infantry, that's just kind of their MO. Wherever things are going on, they're going to tend to be there.
Very good. Well, thank you, John. It was nice to finally get you on the show. Folks, if you want to read more about the 7th Infantry Regiment, the book to get is American Courage, American Carnage. I'll include a link in the show notes and on the website. As I mentioned earlier, the computer game Burden of Command is based on the regiment's actions in World War II, and John was historical advisor. It's a role-playing game where you take command and make decisions for the unit. Now, if you're interested in how real history is turned into engaging and even educational gameplay, I'll share that at patreon.com/WW2podcast. No need to be a patron. I'll make it available to everyone. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Now that is all for this episode. Next time we'll be talking about the fighting around Berlin in the final days of the war. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.